Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a question that, on the surface, might seem pretty simple, but its implications are really anything but. What is money, really? And maybe more critically, why does its fundamental nature matter so much beyond, the balance in your bank account? How does it subtly shape your decisions, your freedom, and maybe even the whole direction of society? We're embarking on a deep dive into The Bitcoin Standard by Saifedean Ammous. Now, this is a book that promises to, well, unravel the very fabric of our financial lives and challenge pretty much everything we thought we knew about currency. Our mission today is to extract the most potent insights, those real aha moments, and frankly, the surprising facts from this dense but incredibly compelling material. Think of this as your shortcut to becoming, well, exceptionally well informed about the fascinating, sometimes surprising history of money, the often overlooked pitfalls of our modern currencies, and the truly disruptive potential of something as new and, yeah, revolutionary as Bitcoin. We've meticulously summarized this insightful audiobook, which covers everything from the earliest forms of ancient bartering, like way back, all the way to the complex digital age we're living in right now. But this deep dive isn't just about, abstract economic theory. It's really about understanding how the very structure of money profoundly shapes our daily choices, our personal freedom, and maybe even the future direction of society itself. And for you, our listener, we'll be specifically looking at how these deep concepts play out in real-world scenarios, particularly right here in the USA.
Yeah, it's fascinating because most of us, we just think of money as, well, a medium of exchange, right? A convenient tool for buying and selling stuff, simple. But Amos, looking through his distinct Austrian economics lens, he just blows that idea right out of the water. He's not satisfied with the conventional wisdom at all. Instead, he really challenges us to think way beyond what we just accept. He paints this compelling picture of money not just as a tool for transactions, but as like a fundamental instrument, a kind of silent architect of our very behavior. It subtly pushes us towards instant gratification or, long-term planning. It shapes what he calls our time preference in ways we probably never even realize. And if we truly internalize his arguments, it forces us to critically evaluate our current financial landscape. We have to seriously consider alternatives that might be more aligned with, say, long-term prosperity, societal advancement, and individual liberty. It's really a re-examination of first principles. It's asking not just what money does, but maybe what kind of people and society does it actually create. That's a deeper question.
Okay, so to really understand money, we kind of have to strip away centuries of complexity and just go back to the basics. Why did we even need money in the first place? Amos kicks off his journey by taking us way back to a time before currency, highlighting the crippling inefficiencies of simple barter. You know, that classic idea. I have apples, you have oranges, we just swap. Sounds easy enough, right?
Seems straightforward, yeah. But the reality is, simple barter runs into this massive roadblock almost immediately. Amos details it meticulously. It's called the double coincidence of wants.
The double coincidence of wants. Okay, that sounds a bit academic. What does it actually mean in practice?
Well, it's not just academic. It's a fundamental friction that severely limits the scale and complexity of trade in any economy. Imagine, just for a second, you're a skilled artisan, right? You craft beautiful wooden furniture.
Okay, got it. I make chairs.
Right. And you need groceries. Now, for a direct trade, you'd have to find a grocer who simultaneously wants one of your handcrafted wooden chairs and agrees on the exact value of that chair in terms of, say, milk, bread, maybe some vegetables.
Okay, that already sounds tricky. What if the grocer doesn't need a chair right now?
Exactly. Or what if the grocer wants eggs, but you only have wheat from trading a small stool earlier? Now you're scrambling to find someone who wants wheat and has eggs you can trade for.
Oh, wow.
Then you got to take those eggs back to the grocer, hoping they still need them and haven't already traded with someone else. The complex, often multi-step chain of trades needed for even a basic transaction becomes astronomical.
Yeah, that sounds incredibly time-consuming and inefficient. You'd spend all your time trying to arrange trades instead of making furniture.
Precisely. It consumes vast amounts of time and energy. It makes large-scale, complex economies practically impossible. Trade gets confined to very small, localized communities where maybe everyone kind of knows what everyone else needs.
So without a common, easily accepted medium, the whole system just collapses under its own weight.
Totally. The logistical weight is just too much.
So, okay, to overcome that limitation, humanity desperately needed something else, something that could easily be exchanged for anything. And this brings us, I think, to Amos's core idea of salability, right? The inherent ease and efficiency with which a particular good can actually function as money.
That's a crucial distinction, yeah.
Yeah.
It's not just can it be traded, but how well does it work as money? And Ammous breaks saleability down into three fundamental dimensions. This gives us a really powerful framework for evaluating any form of money, whether we're talking about ancient seashells or, today's digital currencies. The first dimension is saleability across scale. This basically refers to its divisibility. Can you easily divide a unit of money into smaller bits for everyday transactions like buying a coffee or a bus ticket? And can you also easily combine those units for much larger purchases like buying a car or even a house?
Right, you need both small change and large denominations.
Absolutely essential for broad functionality. Think about it. If your main form of money was, say, a live cow,
Okay.
how would you precisely pay for just one apple or a small bag of rice? You couldn't realistically, carve off a tiny piece of the cow. It's just not practical.
Definitely not.
And this is exactly why early forms of money that weren't easily divisible, like maybe large stones or even certain types of livestock, were inherently limited in how useful they could be.
Makes sense.
Now, if we fast forward to modern times, consider a live example right here in the USA. Think about how ubiquitously we use digital money and mobile payment apps, things like Venmo or PayPal.
Yeah, use them all the time.
Right. For something as simple as splitting a restaurant bill. It perfectly demonstrates how effortlessly divisible and transferable money needs to be today. You can instantly send fractions of a dollar, even down to the cent.
True, just type in the amount and hit send.
Exactly. It simplifies transactions immensely compared to any form of physical barter or, trying to make change with awkward physical items. This level of granular divisibility is just a cornerstone of a functioning, dynamic, modern economy. It enables countless transactions that would otherwise be completely impossible.
Okay, so divisibility is key. What's the second dimension of saleability?
The second is saleability across space, or, more simply, transportability. How easy is it to move this money over distances without it losing value, costing a fortune to move, or just being impractical?
Right, like trying to ship tons of grain versus carrying some gold coins.
Exactly. Contrast it with physical goods that are heavy or perishable or bulky. Imagine trying to transport a whole barn full of wheat across the country for trade,
Nightmare.
or a large herd of cattle across mountains. The logistics alone would be crippling, right? And the potential losses from spoilage or theft could make the whole trade uneconomical.
Yeah, you might lose half your money just getting it there.
But a small, valuable piece of gold, or even easier, a digital transfer of funds today, obviously far more efficient. Money's ability to just transcend geographical barriers is absolutely key for large-scale commerce and, ultimately, global trade.
Okay, scale and space. What's the third, and you said maybe the most critical one for Ammous?
Yeah, arguably the most critical for his whole argument is saleability across time. This is its ability to hold its value over long periods without degrading, decaying, or being excessively inflated away.
The store of value function.
Precisely. And this aspect is absolutely critical for any kind of long-term planning, for saving, for an investment. If your money loses value rapidly because of inflation, what's the incentive to save?
You just spend it quickly before it loses value.
Exactly. Why put money aside if it's going to buy less tomorrow than it does today? It disincentivizes individual savings. And that then impacts everything from your personal retirement planning to the large-scale capital formation needed for building factories, infrastructure, developing new technologies.
So that affects the whole economy's future potential.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If money can't reliably bridge that gap between the present and the future, then the future itself becomes really uncertain. It stifles progress.
Yeah.
And this fundamental requirement, this need for durability over time, it raises a really profound question. How did early societies, without our modern digital tech, even begin to manage these challenges of creating a durable store of value?
Yeah, good question. So given these pretty demanding requirements, divisibility, portability, durability over time, what did early societies actually turn to? What worked, even partially? Ammous takes us on this fascinating historical tour through what he calls primitive monies. He details some really intriguing examples like, specific types of seashells, intricate beads, and probably the most famous or maybe infamous, the massive, almost mythical rice stones of Yap, an island out in the Pacific. I mean, these sound truly bizarre from our modern perspective.
Oh, they absolutely were. And these items gained monetary status for a whole variety of localized, often very specific reasons. Maybe it's due to their scarcity in that particular area.
Yep.
Or maybe their durability against the elements, like certain shells. Or sometimes it was a deep-seated cultural or even religious significance that just made them desirable and accepted within that specific community.
So the rice stones, tell us more about those. They sound wild.
They really were. These weren't just any rocks. They were enormous circular limestone disks. Some weighed several tons, and they were painstakingly quarried from distant islands hundreds of miles away, then laboriously transported back to Yap on rafts and canoes.
Wow, just getting them there was a huge feat.
Immense. The sheer size, the perilous journey, the incredible effort involved, all of this made them extremely scarce and thus inherently valuable within Yapi's society. The difficulty of production was the value signal.
But wait, if they weighed tons, how did you actually use them for trade? You couldn't exactly carry one to the market.
Exactly. Their very immobility severely limited their salability across space. You couldn't pick up a multi-ton rice cone and carry it to the next village, let alone the next island, to settle a debt.
So how did ownership change?
It was fascinating. Ownership was simply transferred by communal memory and public acknowledgement rather than physical exchange. Everyone in the village just knew who owned which part of which stone, even if the stone itself lay untouched for decades, maybe half submerged in the mud somewhere.
That's incredible. A ledger based entirely on social consensus.
Pretty much. But that inherent lack of portability, combined with severe issues of divisibility, you couldn't precisely break off a piece of a rice stone to buy a fish or a few coconuts. It ultimately prevented these systems from scaling beyond their specific localized contexts.
So they worked within a very specific small-scale society, but couldn't support broader trade.
Exactly. They were kind of brilliant within their limited spheres, but fundamentally unsuited for broad, complex economies that needed granular transactions and trade over vast distances.
Okay, so that limitation leads us to another critical concept Ammous introduces for evaluating money, right? The stock-to-flow ratio.
Yes, absolutely critical, stock to flow. It sounds technical, but the concept is quite simple. It's just the existing supply of a commodity, the stock, compared to the rate at which new units are produced over a given period, like a year, the flow.
Okay, stock versus flow. Why is this ratio so important for something to be good money?
Because a high stock to flow ratio is absolutely crucial for maintaining value over time. Think about gold, for instance. The total amount of gold that's ever been mined throughout all of history and is currently in circulation that represents a massive stock.
Right, tons and tons of it held in vaults and jewelry.
Exactly. Now, the amount of new gold mined annually, the flow, is actually a tiny, tiny fraction of that existing stock, maybe 1–2% per year. This makes its supply highly inelastic.
Meaning new production doesn't really change the total supply much.
Precisely. New production doesn't significantly dilute the existing supply, which is key to it maintaining its purchasing power over centuries. Now, contrast that with something easily produced like, well, paper money today, or even many agricultural commodities like corn or wheat. New supply can rapidly flood the market and diminish the value of what already exists. A low stock-to-flow means the value is constantly being diluted by new production.
That's a really clear distinction. It highlights why scarcity isn't quite enough. You need predictable and hard-to-increase scarcity for sound money. And what's fascinating here, if we think about a relatable USA example, is how Ammous's analysis of these primitive monies kind of echoes the collectible market for rare items today. Things like limited edition Pokemon cards or vintage comic books, maybe rare sneakers.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
Their value absolutely stems from scarcity, right? For that specific item, the stock-to-flow ratio is incredibly high because, well, they're not making any more first edition Charizards. The stock is fixed, the flow is zero.
Right.
But while they might hold immense value for collectors, maybe even be seen as an investment, they completely lack the divisibility and, crucially, the universal acceptance needed to function as general money.
Absolutely. You can't pay your rent with a Pokemon card.
Exactly. You can't buy groceries with a vintage Superman comic, can you? They might be a store of value for a very niche market, but they can't scale to facilitate a broad economy. This aligns perfectly with Ammous's explanation of why primitive monies, despite their localized success, just couldn't truly scale into broader monetary systems capable of supporting complex, interconnected societies.
That's spot on. They solved the double coincidence of wants locally, but failed on other dimensions of salability needed for larger scale.
So we've seen how early money worked, and crucially, where it fell short mainly on scalability, divisibility, sometimes portability. But if these primitive forms couldn't support larger, more interconnected economies, what was the natural next evolution? What did humanity turn to when the need for truly scalable money became undeniable?
Well, the limitations of primitive monies naturally paved the way for the rise of monetary metals. This is where Chapter 3 of the Bitcoin Standard takes us. It was a true game changer for economic development and global trade, an era that lasted for centuries.
Right, the age of gold and silver. Ammous explains that metals like these became dominant for some very clear, practical reasons, didn't they?
Yes, absolutely. Their inherent durability was a big one. They don't rot, they don't rust easily, they don't corrode over long periods. Then there's their malleability and divisibility.
Which got a huge boost from the invention of coinage, right? Standardized units.
Exactly. Coinage was a massive innovation, allowing for standardized weights and purities, making transactions much smoother. And crucially, they possess natural scarcity combined with that high stock-to-flow ratio we just talked about. It's hard to find and produce large new quantities quickly.
And gold in particular seemed to emerge as the king of monetary metals. Why gold specifically over, say, silver or copper?
Gold had a confluence of specific, almost ideal advantages. Its exceptionally high stock-to-flow ratio was probably the biggest factor. New gold entering the market is always a tiny fraction of the existing above-ground supply, ensuring its value remained relatively stable and resilient to sudden increases in production. Discovering a new gold mine wouldn't immediately crash the value of all existing gold.
Okay, so superior scarcity.
Superior and predictable scarcity, yes. Plus, gold boasts remarkable chemical stability. It's incredibly resistant to corrosion, rust, or degradation over time. This makes it an unbelievably reliable store of value that could literally span generations.
And it's dense, right? Lots of value in a small package.
Very dense, making it relatively easy to transport concentrated value compared to, say, the equivalent value in silver or other goods. These properties combine durable, divisible via coinage, scarce, high stock-to-flow, chemically stable. Dense made it an ideal medium of exchange and became universally accepted and trusted across vast distances and diverse cultures for centuries, really facilitating the first truly global trade networks.
Sounds almost perfect. But Ammous argues there was an inherent vulnerability, right? Even with gold.
Yes, and this is a critical turning point of the story. This perceived perfection carried an inherent vulnerability, largely due to gold's physical nature and the logistical challenges of using it in large-scale commerce. For convenience and, importantly, security, storing and transacting with large amounts of heavy gold required a degree of centralization.
People didn't want to keep piles of gold under their mattress, especially merchants.
Exactly. This led to the emergence of goldsmiths, who had secure vaults, and then eventually banks. These institutions would hold gold securely on behalf of individuals and businesses. In return, they issued paper notes, essentially IOUs or receipts, which were far more convenient and lightweight to carry and trade as a proxy for the physical metal stored in the vault.
Ah, the birth of paper money, but backed by gold.
Initially, yes. But this is where the system started to bend, introducing fragility. Banks, or the goldsmiths before them, quickly realized that not everyone would demand their actual physical gold back at the exact same time. Most people were happy just trading the paper receipts.
So the gold just sat there most of the time?
Right. Seeing this, banks began to issue more paper notes than the actual amount of gold they held in their vaults. They started lending out these extra notes, effectively creating new money based on debt, not physical reserves. This practice is known as fractional reserve banking.
Okay, fractional reserve. That sounds risky.
It was a fundamental, almost insidious shift. It created this new form of money credit that wasn't fully backed by the physical commodity, and it introduced a profound instability into the system. If for some reason confidence wavered and too many people demanded their physical gold back at once the bank would collapse, simply unable to meet its obligations.
Because the gold wasn't actually all there.
Precisely. And what's fascinating here, from Ammous's perspective, is how this created fertile ground for manipulation. Once these centralized entities, whether they were private banks or later government-chartered central banks, gained control over issuing these paper notes, they could influence the money supply.
They could expand it beyond the physical gold they held.
Exactly. Effectively creating money, or at least credit that functioned like money, out of thin air, limited only by their judgment or regulations. This laid the groundwork for future monetary shifts, where eventually that link between paper money and physical gold would be weakened and then severed entirely.
Opening the door to, well, potentially unprecedented levels of governmental control and, as Ammous argues, the potential for manipulation and instability.
Spot on. And if we consider a live example in the modern era, while direct gold coinage is obviously rare for daily use, you have platforms like Gold Money or others that allow users to buy, sell, and store digital representations of physical gold holdings.
Right, I've seen those.
These services definitely reflect gold's historical role as money and its enduring appeal as a store of value. But they also highlight its limitations in physical transport. You're not holding the gold, and that continued tendency towards centralization for storage, just as Ammous describes. Your digital gold is ultimately held by a third party, a custodian.
And that centralized storage becomes the key point of trust or vulnerability.
Exactly. It becomes susceptible to the very same issues of trust, counterparty risk, and potential manipulation or seizure that plagued physical gold banking centuries ago. The centralization point remains.
So while metals were a massive leap forward, enabling global trade on an unprecedented scale, they also paradoxically introduced this critical vulnerability, the need for centralization, which eventually led to intermediaries gaining control. And that leads us directly to maybe the most controversial part of Ammous's argument. What happens when that central control falls entirely into the hands of governments, as it largely has over the last century or so?
That transition is absolutely critical, yes. And for Ammous, this is the point where money truly lost its soundness, as he defines it. Chapter 4 brings us to the money most of us use today, government money, or what's typically called fiat currency.
Fiat money. So what exactly changed, and what are the implications according to Ammous?
Well, first, let's define fiat money clearly. It's government-issued currency that is not backed by a physical commodity like gold or silver. Its value comes primarily from government decree. The government says it's money, and the collective trust and acceptance of the people using it.
So it's not backed by anything tangible, just by faith in the issuer, essentially.
Essentially, yes. Faith and legal compulsion. And Ammous argues forcefully that these fiat systems, primarily by abandoning the gold standard, the requirement for currency to be redeemable for a fixed amount of gold, allow governments to inflate the money supply pretty much at will.
Because there's no physical anchor limiting how much they can create.
Precisely. There are no natural constraints imposed by the difficulty of mining a physical commodity. This unchecked ability to print money, often managed by central banks, leads, in his view, to a cascade of negative economic consequences. Chief among them is chronic inflation.
Which relentlessly erodes the purchasing power of savings over time.
Exactly. Your money buys less and less each year. He also argues it creates a general environment of economic instability, where prices become less predictable, making long-term planning much harder for individuals and businesses.
He points to the U.S. abandoning the gold standard in 1971 as a pivotal moment, right?
Yes. President Nixon's decision in 1971 to suspend the convertibility of the U.S. dollar into gold is cited as a truly pivotal historical shift. For Ammous, this effectively removed the last major constraint on global money printing, ushering in the modern era of pure fiat currencies worldwide.
And he doesn't just critique the existence of fiat, he critiques how governments enforce its use, correct?
Yes, that's a key part of his argument. It's not just that governments offer fiat money, they actively enforce its use, primarily through taxation, demanding that taxes be paid exclusively in their currency, and through legal tender laws.
Legal tender laws meaning the currency must be accepted for debts.
Right. They stipulate that the government's currency must be accepted for all debts, public and private. For Ammous, this fundamentally undermines its soundness because its value isn't derived from desirable properties like scarcity or utility, but is based ultimately on trust in the government and, implicitly, coercion. Its value is purely a decree, not an emergent property of the market.
And the real-world consequences of this potential for mismanagement can be severe.
Absolutely. They can be stark and often devastating. For a vivid, though thankfully non-USA example, just look at Turkey's hyperinflation episode in 2023.
Yeah, I remember reading about that. It sounded brutal.
It was. At its peak, official annual inflation rates soared well over 80%, with some independent estimates putting it much higher, even into triple digits for certain goods in some months.
80%. That's hard to even imagine.
And this wasn't some random anomaly or a natural disaster hitting the economy. It was widely seen as a direct and undeniable consequence of excessive money printing by the government and central bank, pursuing unorthodox economic policies. This led to a rapid, relentless devaluation of the Turkish lira.
What did that mean for ordinary people?
It meant people's life savings evaporated almost overnight. Their daily wages bought significantly less food, fuel, and basic necessities each week. Businesses struggled to price goods or plan for the future because the value of the currency was plummeting unpredictably.
It just creates chaos.
Complete economic chaos and hardship. It powerfully illustrates Ammous's central point about fiat money's inherent vulnerability to government mismanagement and its potentially devastating impact on the daily lives and long-term prospects of an entire population. It's a stark reminder that when governments can print money without constraint, the value of that money can evaporate incredibly quickly.
Okay, so we see the potential economic instability. But what does this all mean for us individually, beyond just the price changes we see? Ammous argues that the type of money we use doesn't just facilitate transactions, it fundamentally changes our behavior. This takes us to a really fascinating and, frankly, quite profound concept he explores called time preference.
Yes, Chapter 5 introduces time preference. And for Ammous, this is a truly crucial concept. It helps us understand the hidden, maybe even insidious impact of fiat money on society and our individual behavior. At its core, time preference is actually pretty simple. It's just the degree to which individuals prioritize present consumption, getting stuff now over future savings and investment, or delaying gratification for a potentially larger reward later.
So it's basically a measure of our patience. Do we want it now or are we willing to wait?
Exactly. It's a spectrum. And Ammous makes a compelling argument that sound money, with that high stock-to-flow ratio, inherent scarcity, like gold historically, or as he posits, Bitcoin today, naturally encourages what he calls low time preference.
Low time preference, meaning more patience, more focus on the future.
Precisely. In a low time preference environment, people are incentivized to save because they have genuine confidence that their money will retain or maybe even increase its purchasing power over time. They trust their savings won't be silently eroded by inflation.
So saving actually makes sense.
It makes rational sense. And this fosters a societal inclination towards saving. That saving, in turn, fuels productive investment. It provides the capital pool for building things. That investment leads to what economists call capital formation. The patient, long-term building of factories, infrastructure, developing innovative technologies, creating more complex tools. It encourages long-term planning, research, development.
And the ultimate outcome of all that.
The ultimate outcome, according to Ammous, is increased productivity, significant technological advancement, and overall societal flourishing. People are working diligently towards a better, more prosperous future, not just chasing immediate gratification.
Okay, that's the vision with sound money. How does fiat money contrast with that?
Well, it's essentially the opposite effect. Because fiat money is inherently inflationary, designed, in many cases, to lose a little bit of purchasing power each year due to unchecked printing by central banks, it fundamentally incentivizes spending and borrowing now.
Why save if your money will be worth less tomorrow?
Exactly. Or if the interest you might earn on savings in a bank account is actually less than the rate of inflation, meaning you're losing purchasing power even while saving. This environment actively pushes people towards high time preference.
So immediate consumption becomes the rational choice.
It seems rational, yes, often fueled by readily available debt, because delaying gratification seems almost foolish when the value of the money you're saving is constantly eroding. Get it now while you can.
And Ammous argues this high time preference has broad societal impacts.
Profound impacts, he believes, leading to reduced overall productivity in the long run, stagnant real wages. Even if nominal wages go up, they don't buy more. And he even goes so far as to suggest a kind of moral decay.
Moral decay. That sounds pretty strong. How does he connect fiat money to something like morality?
It is strong language. He connects it to a perceived decline in long-term capital investment in favor of short-term speculation, a significant rise in consumer debt levels across society, a cultural focus on maybe speculative bubbles rather than building productive industries. He might point to things like a potential shift in cultural values, maybe towards instant fame or superficial gains over, say, enduring craftsmanship, patient scientific research, or deep intellectual pursuits. He might even suggest it erodes traditional family structures that perhaps relied more on long-term savings and intergenerational wealth transfer, replaced by a more individualistic, present-focused society.
So it's a subtle shift in what society values and prioritizes, driven by the nature of money itself.
That's his argument, yes.
Yeah.
That the monetary system subtly reshapes our collective psyche and priorities towards the short term.
And bringing this back to a very concrete USA example, you can definitely see the explosion of buy now, pay later services like Klarna, Affirm, Afterpay as a direct reflection of this high time preference becoming normalized in fiat economies.
Absolutely.
Consumers are actively encouraged, even celebrated, for prioritizing instant gratification, getting that new gadget or fashion item now, paying later, often without fully considering the long-term cost or the discipline of saving first.
Right. It fits perfectly with Ammous's warning about the societal impact of a monetary system that systematically incentivizes immediate consumption and the accumulation of debt over deferred gratification and patient long-term planning.
It's not just a convenient payment method. You could argue it's a powerful symptom of a deeper monetary influence on our collective behavior.
Ammous would certainly argue that. He'd say platforms like Klarna are merely symptoms, perfectly logical outcomes of a monetary system that punishes saving and rewards immediate consumption.
Okay, so if money can so fundamentally distort our personal choices and our relationship with time, what about its impact on the bigger economic system? You mentioned Amis builds a case for money serving as capitalism's core information system. How does that work?
Yes, this is another fascinating layer to his argument, explored in Chapter 6. He connects money directly to a concept originally explored by the Nobel laureate economist Friedrich Hayek. The idea that money, and specifically the prices expressed in that money, act as a vital information system for the entire economy.
So it's not just a medium of exchange, it's also carrying crucial signals.
Exactly. It's like the economy's nervous system, constantly transmitting information. Ammous explains that in a sound money system, one with a stable and predictable supply, prices are able to accurately reflect true underlying supply and demand conditions. Prices aren't just arbitrary numbers on a tag, they're intricate, unbiased signals. They coordinate the actions of millions of uncoordinated individuals.
Yeah.
A genuinely higher price tells producers, hey, society values this more right now, make more of it.
And a lower price signals the opposite.
Right, maybe pull back here, allocate your resources somewhere else where they're more needed. These stable and accurate price signals are absolutely vital for efficient economic coordination and resource allocation across a vast, complex economy.
So businesses know what to produce, consumers know what things are truly worth relative to each other.
Precisely. Sound money allows prices to genuinely reflect relative scarcity and consumer preferences, guiding businesses to invest capital in truly productive ventures and allocate scarce resources where they are most needed and desired by society. It allows for rational economic calculation.
Okay, that's the ideal with sound money. How does fiat money mess this up, according to Amis?
Well, he argues that inflationary fiat policies, which involve the often arbitrary expansion of the money supply by central banks, severely distort these crucial price signals. It's like adding static or noise to that economic nervous system.
How does that distortion happen?
When new money is injected into the system, it doesn't magically appear in everyone's pockets simultaneously or evenly. It typically enters through specific channels, maybe through the banking system, via lower interest rates, or through government spending.
Right, it doesn't spread out uniformly.
Exactly. It flows through specific channels first, often benefiting those closest to the money printer initially.
Mhm.
This creates artificial booms in certain sectors, lowers interest rates below their natural market level, and generally creates a haze of false signals. It's like looking at the economy through a funhouse mirror.
So businesses might misinterpret what's happening.
Yes, they might mistake cheap credit or artificially inflated demand in one sector as a sign of genuine sustainable consumer preference or economic strength, rather than just an effect of monetary expansion.
Mm.
This leads them to overinvest or misallocate capital based on faulty information.
And this is what Amos calls malinvestment.
Exactly. Resources get poured into unproductive or, more often, unsustainable ventures because the true cost of capital and the real patterns of consumer demand are obscured by the inflationary environment. It's like, as the analogy goes, building an ice cream factory in the Arctic because the distorted financial signals somehow trick you into thinking everyone there suddenly crave popsicles year-round. The investment is based on false information.
He points to historical events like the 2008 housing crisis as a prime example, right?
Yes, he sees the 2008 global financial crisis, particularly the U.S. housing bubble that preceded it, as a massive example of fiat-induced malinvestment and the subsequent bust cycle. He argues that easy money policies from the Federal Reserve in the early 2000s pushed interest rates artificially low.
Making mortgages incredibly cheap.
Right. This artificially inflated demand for housing and real estate, encouraging excessive borrowing and speculation. Huge amounts of capital, labor, and resources were misallocated into building more houses than the market could sustainably support based on real savings and income.
And then when interest rates started to rise, or reality set in,
The whole thing collapsed. The bubble burst, leading to widespread mortgage defaults, bank failures, and a painful global recession. It was a classic boom and bust cycle, driven, in his view, by distorted price signals originating from the fiat monetary system.
And to bring this concept to an even more recent USA example, you could look at the wild 2021-2022 crypto market frenzy. While Bitcoin itself is distinct, the absolute explosion of thousands of highly speculative altcoins, NFTs, and decentralized finance projects during that period, followed by their dramatic and often complete collapse.
Yeah, that was quite something.
They could argue that boom was significantly fueled, at least in part, by the extremely loose monetary policy and near-zero interest rates happening in the fiat system at the time. Massive amounts of newly created fiat currency were sloshing around looking for yield.
Right, chasing returns in a low-interest environment.
And much of it poured into these highly speculative, often experimental, and sometimes outright fraudulent crypto ventures, rather than traditional, productive, long-term investments in the real economy.
It certainly seemed that way. A lot of capital chasing hype.
Then, when the fiat faucet tightened, when central banks started raising interest rates aggressively to combat the inflation they'd arguably helped create, these speculative bubbles burst spectacularly. It demonstrates the real-world consequences Ammous talks about: distorted information leading capital to flow into potentially unproductive or unsustainable avenues that ultimately destroy wealth rather than create it.
It's a powerful recent example of that malinvestment cycle potentially playing out, fueled by shifts in fiat monetary policy.
So, okay, distorted signals, malinvestment, boom-bust cycles. What does this all mean for our individual power and freedom beyond just economic efficiency? Ammous makes a powerful, almost philosophical case here, doesn't he? That sound money isn't just about economics. It's fundamentally about individual freedom and sovereignty.
Yes, absolutely. Chapter 7 makes this connection very explicit. For Ammous, sound money is profoundly about limiting the reach and power of centralized control, specifically government control, over an individual's wealth and economic life.
How does sound money achieve that limitation?
Because its supply is predictable, outside the control of political actors, and cannot be arbitrarily increased, it prevents governments from covertly taxing their citizens through the mechanism of inflation. This is really key for him.
Inflation as a hidden tax.
Exactly. It's a tax on savings and cash holdings, enacted without needing direct legislative approval or explicit public debate. It just happens as the money supply expands faster than the real economy. Fiat money, by stark contrast, inherently enables governments to manipulate economies through monetary expansion and the accumulation of vast amounts of debt.
Which erodes personal sovereignty.
He argues it does, yes, because it gives the state immense power over the economic sphere, allowing it to fund projects, wars, or bailouts without imposing direct, transparent taxes that voters might resist. It suddenly concentrates power in the hands of central authorities, central banks, and governments who control the money supply. It effectively turns your savings into a political instrument rather than a stable, independent store of value that you control.
And this is where Bitcoin enters the picture again as a potential solution.
Precisely. This is where Bitcoin comes in as a truly revolutionary force in his narrative. Ammous highlights its fundamentally decentralized and censorship-resistant properties as direct solutions to the vulnerabilities inherent in centralized fiat systems.
Decentralized meaning no single point of control.
Exactly. Unlike traditional banking systems where a central authority, a bank, a payment processor, or a government can freeze your account, confiscate your funds, or block specific transactions, Bitcoin operates on a peer-to-peer network. There's no CEO to call, no government agency to pressure into blocking payments.
And censorship-resistant means transactions can't easily be stopped.
Right. If you have the private key to your Bitcoin and you want to send it to someone else and you're willing to pay the network transaction fee, no third party can arbitrarily prevent that transaction from being confirmed on the blockchain. This design fundamentally empowers individuals by removing those powerful intermediaries.
Banks, governments.
Yes, removing them from the critical path of transactions. It allows for direct, permissionless exchange of value between any two people anywhere in the world, promoting a level of financial autonomy and independence that, Ammous argues, hasn't really been possible on a large scale since maybe the era of physical gold-bearer assets, but now in a digital form.
And this isn't just theoretical, right? There are real-world examples.
Absolutely. The power of censorship resistance has been demonstrated visibly. For a powerful, albeit non-USA example, consider the events in Canada back in 2022 during the trucker protests against COVID-19 mandates.
Yeah, I remember the government took some drastic measures.
They did. The Canadian government invoked emergency powers and ordered financial institutions to freeze the bank accounts of individuals and organizations associated with the protests without needing a court order. Suddenly, citizens found their life savings, their access to the traditional financial system, completely cut off by government decree.
Wow. Regardless of your view on the protest, that's a huge amount of power.
It is. It highlighted the immense power central authorities wield over the conventional fiat banking system. However, during this time, supporters started sending donations to the protesters using Bitcoin.
And the government couldn't stop those.
They couldn't easily stop the peer-to-peer transactions. Bitcoin donations enabled funding to continue flowing, bypassing the traditional financial system's choke points that were under government control. People could send and receive value without needing a bank's permission and without being subject to immediate government censorship or seizure in the same way.
That's a very concrete example illustrating Ammous's point about Bitcoin's unique ability to bypass state control and offer a truly independent alternative for transmitting value, especially when traditional channels are compromised or weaponized.
Exactly. It demonstrated that censorship resistance isn't just a technical feature. It has profound real-world implications for individual liberty and the ability to transact freely.
Okay, that's a compelling case for Bitcoin's role in individual freedom. And it's fascinating how its design seems to directly address those vulnerabilities, especially the centralization that ultimately proved to be gold's Achilles heel. But for many listeners, Bitcoin itself might still feel like a bit of a black box. How does this digital money actually work? How does it manage to achieve this decentralization and censorship resistance? What are the core mechanics?
Yeah, you're right. Understanding the basic mechanics is definitely key to appreciating its significance and why Ammous sees it as so revolutionary. He dedicates a significant portion of the book, Chapter 8, to explaining Bitcoin itself. He introduces it as this new form of digital money, meticulously designed and released by the anonymous creator, or creators, known only as Satoshi Nakamoto back in 2008. Notably, right in the immediate aftermath of the global financial crisis.
Perfect timing almost.
Almost feels intentional, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's presented as a truly decentralized, immutable digital currency, fundamentally different from anything that had come before it.
So what are those core mechanics that make it different?
Ammous delves into them, and they are crucial for understanding why he considers it sound money. First, there's the blockchain. You've probably heard the term.
Yeah, thrown around a lot. What is it simply?
Think of it as a distributed public ledger, like a giant shared digital accounting book that records every single Bitcoin transaction ever made. This ledger isn't stored in one central place. It's copied and spread across thousands of computers or nodes all over the world.
So everyone has a copy or can see it.
Exactly. Every transaction is transparently added to this ledger in chronological blocks, forming a chain. And once a block of transactions is added and confirmed by the network, it's virtually impossible to alter or remove those entries later. This ensures incredible security, transparency, and auditability. Everyone can verify the ledger, but no single entity controls it or can change the past.
Okay, so a shared tamper-proof ledger. What secures it? What makes it tamper-proof?
That brings us to the second key mechanic, proof of work. This is the ingenious consensus mechanism that secures the network and ensures everyone agrees on the valid history of transactions. It requires special participants, known as miners, to expend significant computational power, real-world energy solving complex cryptographic puzzles.
The mining process.
Right. The first miner to solve the puzzle gets the right to propose the next block of transactions to be added to the blockchain. As a reward for their effort and energy expenditure, they receive newly minted Bitcoin, plus the transaction fees from that block.
So they're incentivized to do this work honestly.
Yes, and crucially, this energy expenditure makes it incredibly costly and computationally difficult for any malicious actor to try and cheat the system or rewrite the blockchain history. To do so, they'd need to consistently outmine the honest majority of the network, requiring an astronomical amount of energy and computing power. It provides this immense layer of security and integrity that doesn't rely on trusting a central bank or government. It's security through applied energy and computational work, not trust in a fallible third party.
Okay, blockchain ledger, proof of work security. What's the third key piece?
Perhaps the most critical piece for Ammous's sound money argument. Bitcoin has a fixed supply. This is absolutely fundamental. Only 21 million Bitcoins will ever exist. This isn't just a policy. It's mathematically encoded into the Bitcoin protocol itself.
It can't be changed.
Not without overwhelming consensus from the entire network, which is extremely unlikely given the incentives. This hard, immutable cap embedded in the code prevents any future inflation of the supply by decree. It's a stark contrast to fiat currencies where the supply can be and routinely is expanded by central banks based on political or economic goals.
So those three things together: decentralized blockchain, energy-backed proof of work, and the absolutely fixed supply.
Those collectively are what, for Ammous, truly elevate Bitcoin to the status of sound money, perhaps the soundest money ever created. Its supply cannot be manipulated by any authority. Its history is immutable, and its transactions are secured by a costly, decentralized process rather than reliance on a potentially fallible or corruptible central entity.
And beyond these core properties, how does it stack up on those salability dimensions we talked about earlier? Scale, space, time?
It stacks up incredibly well, often surpassing traditional forms. Its salability across scale is amazing due to its incredible divisibility. One Bitcoin can be divided down to 8 decimal places. That smallest unit, 0.00000000001 BTC, is called a Satoshi.
Wow, tiny fractions.
Yeah, this means it can theoretically facilitate both tiny microtransactions and massive multi-million-dollar transfers with equal ease, technologically speaking. That enhances its potential salability across scale in a way physical gold, for example, never could achieve practically.
And across space, portability.
Its scalability across space is perhaps its most obvious advantage over physical commodities. Being purely digital, it has global accessibility via the internet. Anyone with an internet connection can send or receive Bitcoin from virtually anywhere in the world, almost instantly for certain types of transactions, or within about 10 minutes for on-chain confirmation.
Bypassing borders and traditional banking systems.
Completely. It overcomes the logistical nightmares of transporting physical gold or silver across borders, and it avoids the often slow, expensive, and heavily regulated traditional banking networks for international transfers.
There was that example from El Salvador, right,
Yeah.
showing this in action.
Yes, exactly. For a powerful non-USA example of Bitcoin space salability, look at El Salvador, especially around 2023 after it adopted Bitcoin as legal tender. Remittances, money sent home by workers living and working abroad, are a huge economic lifeline for many families and the country itself.
And traditionally, sending that money costs a lot.
Exactly. Traditional remittance channels like Western Union or MoneyGram often charge significant fees, sometimes 5%, 10%, or even more, and transfers can take days. With Bitcoin, particularly using the Lightning Network built on top of it, people could send remittances back home almost instantly and for drastically lower fees, sometimes just pennies.
That's a huge difference for people relying on that money.
A massive difference. It showcases Bitcoin's ability to bypass those costly, slow, and often heavily regulated traditional financial intermediaries, making cross-border value transfer much more efficient, faster, and accessible, especially for people in developing nations. It's a real-world demonstration of Ammous's point about its potential to revolutionize how value moves globally.
Okay, so Bitcoin's design seems to directly tackle these historical problems: centralization, inflation, censorship, borders. Its decentralized, immutable, fixed supply nature offers this direct counter-argument. But this raises that important question you posed earlier. What is Bitcoin really for? Is it meant to replace my credit card for buying coffee every day? Or is its purpose something deeper, more foundational?
Yeah, that's a really common point of confusion, and Chapter 9 addresses it head-on. Many people hear digital currency and immediately think, okay, so I should be using it to buy my groceries or my daily coffee. Ammous argues quite definitively that while Bitcoin can technically be used for small everyday transactions, especially with secondary layers like Lightning, that's not its primary purpose or its most important value proposition. He believes its true significance lies elsewhere.
So, if not mainly for coffee, then what is its primary role in his view?
His primary argument is that Bitcoin excels, first and foremost, as a superior store of value. He hammers this point home. Why? Because of its unparalleled high stock-to-flow ratio, arguably the highest of any asset, now that the flow, new issuance, keeps decreasing over time, and its absolute mathematically enforced resistance to inflation.
Better than gold in that respect.
He argues yes, potentially better. Unlike gold, whose supply can still be increased, albeit slowly, through new mining discoveries and technological improvements in extraction, Bitcoin's total supply is strictly permanently capped at 21 million coins by its core code.
Digital scarcity perfected.
That's essentially his claim. This makes it, in his view, a digital equivalent to gold, but with potentially even stronger monetary properties in terms of its predictable scarcity, its portability across space, its divisibility, and its absolute resistance to political manipulation or sudden supply shocks.
So its main job is preserving wealth over long periods.
Exactly. Protecting wealth from the silent erosion of fiat inflation and from potential government interference or confiscation. He sees it as the most reliable form of hard money ever created, ideal for long-term savings and wealth preservation.
Okay, store value is primary. Does he see other significant rules for it?
Yes, building on that foundation,
Mm.
he elaborates on its secondary but still vital role as a global settlement network, particularly for large institutions.
Settlement network, what does that mean practically?
While maybe not ideally suited for millions of tiny daily coffee purchases directly on its base layer due to transaction fees and confirmation times, Bitcoin is exceptionally well suited for settling large, value-dense transactions. Think major international business payments, transfers between financial institutions, maybe even transactions between central banks or nations in the future.
So moving large sums securely and finally.
Precisely. It allows these entities to bypass the traditional, often slow, expensive, and complex global financial systems like the SWIFT network for international bank transfers. Bitcoin allows for direct, peer-to-peer transfer of significant value at scale, with a degree of finality, meaning the transaction can't easily be reversed later. That's often not possible in traditional systems.
And he envisions this scaling up significantly.
He does. Ammous paints a bold vision where Bitcoin could eventually ascend to become a kind of global reserve currency or asset, much like the gold standard once functioned. Not necessarily replacing national currencies entirely, but serving as the neutral, sound, foundational settlement layer upon which other currencies and financial instruments could potentially be built or valued against.
Wow, that's a huge vision. Bitcoin as the bedrock of a new global monetary order.
It's a very bold vision, yes.
Yeah.
One where Bitcoin acts as this ultimate neutral settlement layer, fostering global stability and implicitly discouraging inflationary policies by governments worldwide because there's this sound money alternative readily available.
And here's where it gets really interesting, seeing glimpses of this already playing out, especially here in the USA. Remember back in 2021 when Tesla made that huge, highly publicized $1.5 billion investment in Bitcoin?
Oh yeah, that made massive headlines.
That move really highlighted this emerging role as a corporate store of value, directly aligning with Ammous's vision for institutional adoption. For Tesla, that wasn't primarily about enabling customers to buy cars with Bitcoin, though they briefly experimented with that. The main drivers seemed to be protecting their corporate treasury reserves, their cash holdings, from the ongoing devaluation of the US dollar due to inflation. It was framed as a strategic move to safeguard their capital in an asset they perceived as sound and potentially immune to central bank manipulation.
Right, treating it like digital gold on their balance sheet.
Exactly. It was a concrete example of a major innovative company treating Bitcoin not just as a short-term speculative bet, but as a serious tool for long-term wealth preservation, a hedge against fiat currency risk.
A clear signal of that institutional store value use case taking shape.
Definitely. But okay, Ammous presents this compelling case, but he surely doesn't ignore the pushback, right? Bitcoin faces a lot of criticism.
Oh, absolutely not. He doesn't shy away from the hard questions or the prevalent criticisms that are constantly leveled against Bitcoin. Chapter 10 is dedicated to confronting these common concerns head-on, providing his counter-arguments, and trying to further solidify his case for Bitcoin's soundness and utility.
What's the biggest one he tackles? Probably the energy consumption, right? That comes up all the time.
Yes, the energy consumption issue is arguably one of the most frequent and persistent criticisms. You constantly hear reports highlighting the immense amount of electricity used by Bitcoin mining globally, often comparing it to the energy use of entire countries, suggesting it's inherently wasteful and environmentally damaging.
So how does Ammous respond to that? Because it does use a lot of energy.
He provides a robust counterargument. He doesn't deny the energy use. Instead, he argues that it is not wasteful. He contends it's entirely justified and, in fact, absolutely necessary because that energy expenditure is the security mechanism. That proof of work is what makes Bitcoin decentralized, immutable, censorship-resistant, and fundamentally sound money.
So the energy cost is the price of security and decentralization.
That's his core point. It's the cost of achieving truly trustless, decentralized monetary sovereignty, something never before possible. He argues that this provides a fundamental service, secure hard money, independent of states and banks, and that the fiat system it aims to compete with achieves its security and operation through often hidden but arguably far greater total costs.
What kinds of hidden costs for fiat?
Well, Think about the massive, sprawling physical infrastructure of the global banking system. Countless skyscrapers, thousands of bank branches, armored trucks, secure data centers, legions of employees. Then consider the immense military expenditure often required, historically and currently, to protect global trade routes and access to resources like oil, which have often underpinned the geopolitical power supporting dominant fiat currencies like the dollar.
That's a broader perspective on cost.
And don't forget the direct and indirect economic costs of inflation itself, which constantly, silently saps the value from every single person's savings and wages. Ammous argues Bitcoin's energy consumption is transparent, auditable, and directly tied to its security budget, unlike the diffuse, often unquantified, and arguably much larger societal and environmental costs associated with maintaining the global fiat system.
And tying this back to the US, there have been some interesting developments with mining here, right? Trying to address the environmental angle.
Yes, absolutely. To bring in a fascinating USA example, Bitcoin mining operations, particularly in places like Texas in recent years, around 2023 especially, have increasingly started to leverage renewable energy sources and innovative energy solutions.
Like what specifically?
Well, one major area is capturing wasted natural gas from oil field flaring. Normally, this excess gas, a potent greenhouse gas itself, is just burned off into the atmosphere as a byproduct of oil extraction, a huge waste and source of pollution. Bitcoin miners can set up mobile mining units right at the wellhead, use that otherwise flared gas to generate electricity on-site, and power their miners.
So turning waste pollution into productive energy use.
Exactly. They're effectively monetizing wasted energy and reducing emissions compared to just flaring it. Additionally, miners are increasingly co-locating with large solar and wind farms. They can buy up excess renewable power when generation is high, but grid demand is low, helping to make those renewable projects more economically viable.
Acting like a buyer of last resort for renewables.
Or even as a load balancer for the grid. Some miners participate in demand response programs, agreeing to shut down their operations during peak grid demand to free up power for homes and businesses, helping to stabilize the grid. These innovations directly counter the simplistic environmental critiques by showing how mining can actually incentivize renewable energy development, utilize otherwise stranded or wasted energy resources, and even support grid stability. It strongly supports Ammous's defense of mining as potentially a productive, value-creating use of energy, not just inherently wasteful.
Okay, that's a really interesting counter-narrative on energy. What's another major criticism he addresses? The used by criminals argument.
Yes, the concern about use in illegal activities. You often hear politicians or media reports claiming Bitcoin is primarily used for money laundering, drug trafficking, terrorism financing, and other illicit activities because it's supposedly anonymous.
So does Ammous deny that it's used for crime?
No, he doesn't deny that it can be used for illicit activities. Just like any form of money or valuable asset cash, gold, diamonds, regular bank transfers, they're all used by criminals too. But he has very straightforward report regarding Bitcoin's suitability for crime, grounded in its technical reality. He points out that Bitcoin's public, permanent, and transparent ledger, the blockchain, actually makes it far less anonymous and much more traceable than physical cash.
Less anonymous than cash. How so?
Every single Bitcoin transaction, from the moment a coin is mined to every time it changes hands, is recorded forever on that public blockchain. Anyone can view this history. While the addresses themselves are pseudonymous, just strings of letters and numbers, not inherently tied to your real-world identity, specialized blockchain analytics firms and law enforcement agencies have become incredibly sophisticated at analyzing transaction patterns, clustering addresses, and linking them to real-world exchanges or individuals.
So it leaves a permanent digital trail.
A permanent, immutable digital trail. For true, untraceable anonymity, Ammous argues, physical cash remains vastly superior. Cash transactions leave no inherent digital footprint, and once cash changes hands, especially in person, it's virtually impossible to trace definitively. Bitcoin's inherent transparency, ironically, is a feature that makes large-scale, long-term criminal enterprises that rely on moving significant value significantly more challenging and risky than using large amounts of untraceable physical cash. Criminals get caught using Bitcoin precisely because it's traceable.
Okay, that flips the common perception. What about the scalability issue? Bitcoin often seems slow compared to Visa or MasterCard.
Right, the scalability question. People point out that the Bitcoin network can currently only process a handful of transactions per second on its base layer, compared to the tens of thousands per second that major credit card networks can handle. So the question is it really built to handle global commerce with billions of potential users making millions of daily transactions?
How does Ammous view this apparent limitation?
His view on scalability is nuanced and really crucial for understanding his perspective on Bitcoin's core purpose. He explains that the main Bitcoin protocol, the base layer, was deliberately designed with certain trade-offs. Its primary goals were maximizing immutability, security, and decentralization, not necessarily maximizing raw transaction throughput for everyday purchases.
So security and decentralization were prioritized over speed on the base layer.
Exactly. He argues its fundamental strength lies in being the most secure, unchangeable, globally distributed, and censorship-resistant settlement layer imaginable, a base layer of a truly hard digital money. He suggests, and the ecosystem is actively developing this, that other layers or off-chain solutions can be built on top of this secure base layer to handle high volumes of smaller, faster transactions.
Like the Lightning Network.
The Lightning Network is the prime example. It's a second-layer protocol built on Bitcoin that allows for near-instantaneous, extremely low-cost Bitcoin transactions between participants without needing every single small payment to be recorded directly on the main blockchain immediately. Think of it like opening a tab between parties.
So the main chain is for final settlement, like large bank transfers, and layers handle the small stuff.
That's a good analogy. The main Bitcoin blockchain remains the ultimate, secure, immutable base layer for final settlement of large value, while second layers like Lightning can handle the massive volume of everyday microtransactions efficiently. He uses the analogy of the internet itself. The core TCP/IP protocol wasn't designed for high-definition video streaming, but applications like Netflix are built on top of it to deliver that service.
So the perceived slowness of the base layer isn't necessarily a flaw, but a design choice for maximum security.
For Ammous, yes. The core protocol's deliberate design for ultimate immutability and security, requiring broad consensus for any changes, is a fundamental feature, not a bug. You wouldn't want the foundational rules of your money changing constantly based on expediency.
What about all the other cryptocurrencies, altcoins? Does he address those?
Oh, yes. He holds a famously, let's say, dismissive stance on the vast majority of altcoins. Basically, all cryptocurrencies other than Bitcoin and the general blockchain hype that often surrounds projects claiming to use blockchains for everything under the sun.
He's not a fan.
Generally, no. For Ammous, most of these are largely distractions from Bitcoin's singular, unique core value proposition of truly sound, scarce, decentralized money. He argues that most altcoins either fail to achieve genuine decentralization, often having founders, foundations, or venture capitalists with significant control, possess inflationary or unpredictable monetary policies, or compromise fundamental security and immutability in pursuit of higher transaction speeds or more features.
Making them ultimately unsound as money, in his view.
Exactly. He sees most of them as, at best, speculative technology ventures, or at worst, poorly designed money or even scams that fundamentally miss the crucial elements, the immaculate conception without a central issuer, the fixed supply, the proof-of-work security that make Bitcoin unique and potentially world-changing as a monetary asset. Yeah.
He's
He's very focused on Bitcoin's specific properties.
Okay, that covers the main criticisms and his responses. This whole journey through monetary history and the emergence of Bitcoin really forces you to think differently about something we use every day.
It absolutely does, and it raises, I think, an important question for you, the listener, to ponder. As you reflect on this deep dive from barter to rhinestones, gold, fiat, and now Bitcoin, what stands out to you the most about how the very nature of money influences our world, our choices, and our future? How might these ideas from Ammous shape your own understanding of value and finance going forward?
What a deep dive indeed. We've really journeyed from the absolute basics of ancient barter right up to the cutting edge of digital gold, all meticulously guided by Saifedean Ammous's provocative insights from the Bitcoin Standard. We've seen how money first evolved as this ingenious solution to that crippling inefficiency of barter, the double coincidence of wants problem, which really paved the way for trade beyond immediate neighbors. We've explored why those fundamental properties, salability across scale, divisibility, space, portability, and crucially time, store value, along with that high stock-to-flow ratio, are just absolutely critical for any form of money to actually function effectively and serve a complex economy over the long run. We then trace that fascinating but ultimately problematic path of how the centralization that became necessary for managing physical gold inadvertently led to intermediaries gaining power, eventually culminating in the rise of government-controlled fiat money. And we delved into the profound, often hidden implications that Ammous argues this shift to unchecked fiat has had. influencing our collective time preference, subtly nudging society towards instant gratification, and potentially distorting the vital information system of our economy, leading to those destructive cycles of malinvestment and boom and bust. Just understanding these foundational ideas, regardless of whether you agree with his conclusions about Bitcoin, is so crucial for making sense of today's often confusing financial headlines, and for thinking critically about planning for your own future, recognizing the subtle but powerful forces at play.
Absolutely. And if we try to connect all these threads back to the bigger picture, Ammous presents this truly provocative, even revolutionary vision of a potential future. A future where sound money, and he specifically points to Bitcoin as a prime candidate, could fundamentally reshape not only individual freedom by limiting state control over finance, but also the very fabric of global economics. He envisions it potentially nudging us collectively back towards a lower time preference society, one that values long-term investment, patient saving, and the creation of durable, productive endeavors over just immediate gratification and fleeting consumption. This isn't just about understanding a new type of digital currency. He's proposing a potential paradigm shift in how we value, how we exchange, and ultimately how we organize our wealth and structure our societies, potentially shifting significant power away from centralized authorities back towards the individual.
So, what does all of this mean for you listening right now? Maybe consider this final provocative thought to mull over. If Amis is even partially right, if the very nature of the money we use every single day fundamentally influences whether we collectively choose immediate gratification and consumption or long-term investment and saving, then what kind of money do we really want guiding our society and influencing our own lives? What steps might you take just to understand its profound impact more deeply in your own financial decisions and planning? We really encourage you to reflect on those real world examples we discussed today, from the simple act of splitting a bill on Venmo, highlighting the need for divisibility, to major corporations like Tesla using Bitcoin as a treasury reserve asset, hinting at its store of value potential. Consider how these powerful concepts, these deep monetary forces, are already playing out all around us, subtly influencing the choices we all make every single day. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the Bitcoin Standard. Until next time, keep digging for those nuggets of knowledge.